In this tutorial, we're going to show you how to use a gadget to easily create a perfectly sized rounded blank ready for rotary machining. This may be required if you don't already have a perfectly round blank, or that we may be starting from a square stock. So now you can see this is where we're aiming for, but let's see how we actually get there and how we create this toolpath. So we're going to come up to File and Close, and we're going to click Create a New File, and we're going to look at setting up our job sheet. So our job type is set to rotary, our length is 12 inches, diameter 3 inches, units are of course inches. Z0 position off the cylinder axis, as we don't know if the cylinder is perfectly round, or in this case, or even all the way around. XY datum position is in the bottom left. The orientation is along the x-axis because that is the setup for my machine, so do change this if your machine is set up differently. And my modeling resolution I've set to very high. I'm happy with those settings, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Okay, at this stage I could make a finishing toolpath, but I know that my stock or material that I'm working with is not actually currently the correct size, so I need to trim that down. So in VCarve Pro and Aspire we actually have a great tool to help us accomplish this, which is called the Create Running Toolpath, which is under the Gadgets Wrapping Create Running Toolpath part of the menu. So let's open that up and let's have a look at our form. So in the form you can see we've got a description of the random toolpath, but we also have various options. Now you can see the first one is the blank size and shape. So this is where you either have a square stock or you have a round stock. So if you might use a round stock, for example, if you have a round stock that you want to machine on, but it's a little bit too big for what your current project needs are. So you could actually change the diameter here to what you need it to be from what it currently is. In this case though, I want to round off the corners of my square stock, and I want to round these off, cut these away, and I want to use a value of 3.25, which is just slightly bigger than our diameter, if you recall, that we set in the job setup sheet. And this will be for finishing purposes. So below that you can see we have various machining methodologies that we have: radial, around the cylinder, raster along the cylinder, and we have optimized raster along cylinder, machines off corners first, and that's for the square blank only. And what this will do is actually raster along the cylinder, but it will machine off the corners first. So that's for square blanks only. Now, you could of course use these options here if your blank was round and you wanted to, as I mentioned earlier, cut it down to a size that is needed for your project if your current round blank is larger. So you can choose the different methodologies depending on what you need. But in this case, because I'm using a square stock, I'll be going for the optimized raster to cut off those corners. So on the right here you also have the allowance option, and this is where you can leave a amount of material to leave on the cylinder, and you can use that to do a semi-finishing pass with a particularly coarse tool, for example, if you wanted to do some finishing up on your blank. But for now I'm happy with my settings. I'm going to go over to choose a tool, so I can click on select. In this case I'm going to use my core wrench end mill. I've checked these settings previously and I made sure these are safe and sound for my machine, so do make sure that they are safe and appropriate for your machine depending on what tool you are using. And at the bottom here you can see we've got a cylinder dimension, so we've got the length, the diameter, 12 inches for the length and 3 inches for the diameter, which is what we've set up in our job setup sheet. And before we close out this form, it should be noted that this is the default toolpath name, and you can change this if you want to, but I'm actually happy with this because it's the only random toolpath I'll be using in this tutorial, so I'm happy to keep it as the current name, but you can change that if you need to something else. So for example, random toolpath blank, if you wanted to put that on there as well. But I'm happy with how it is, so I'm going to click OK, and that has now created our rounding toolpath. Now, how can we see it? Well, we need to pop over to our toolpath menu. So let's go to the top left here and switch to our toolpath menu. So you can see the toolpath menus open up on the right hand side, but we're going to pop over to the 3D view first, because you can see our toolpath. You can see it's been checked over here, and you can see if I move this around using the right mouse click, or I can use the view control up on the top right here, that the blank has been created and simulated, so we can cut away those corners and get our final rounded blank. So let's have a look at some of our material setup settings though before we go into any toolpathing. So let's pop up and hit the set button up here. So in the material setup form you can see we've got the diameter, the XY datum position and the Z0 position. They've all been pulled through from the job setup screen. So we've got 3 inches, XY datum position on the bottom left, and the Z0 is the center of the cylinder as we set up before. Model position we don't need to worry about because I'm not using a model. Rapid Z gap above material, I've set these to safe and sound settings for my machine, so the clearance and the plunge are safe for my particular machine. So double check these before you go and run this on your machine, because you will need to make sure that your settings are safe and appropriate for your particular setup. And the same applies for the Z gap above material. I'll click OK, and you'll notice I get a pop-up. And this is saying if I've changed anything, that all toolpaths must be recalculated, but I haven't changed anything, so I can safely click No, and we should be good to now have a look at our rounding toolpath. So if we go into the Preview Toolpath menu, we can preview our selected toolpath, and you'll see that it unwraps it first, does the machining, and then wraps the result. And you can see here we've created our rounding toolpath. That is to the diameter set in the rounding toolpath menu. And you notice I can move it around with the right mouse click, or I can use the view control up the top here, and I can use that to have a look at it. Now I'm going to keep it in this view here, so you can see when I turn the toolpath on what it's actually doing. And as I pointed out earlier, it's machining off all the corners to create this rounded toolpath. You can see how the tool path is starting at the top here and kind of cutting away as it goes down and around. But to look at this in some further detail, let's go to our view over here. I'm going to turn off our color shaded view, and we're just going to zoom in. You can see the square that is created in the software to cut down to that rounded shape. And you can now see that around this toolpath, it's taking a stepped routine inwards to achieve that final diameter of the 3.25 inches, where the tool is cutting on this stepped routine to make sure that the overall diameter is cut accurately. And another thing to keep in mind is if we go back to the view and turn on the color shaded view again, you need to make sure that your XY plane is parallel to the flat edge of your blank, because what can happen is if this is rotated in any way, you might end up cutting in free space or not cutting your blank correctly. So you need to ensure that your stock is set up with a flat edge planar to the XY plane, so you make sure that this isn't rotated in any way, so you end up cutting into free space or cutting parts of the blank that did not need cutting. So overall that will help you get a more accurate cut. Now with that said, we can take a look at saving our toolpath. So let's close out the preview form and let's go up to the Save Toolpath form. Now you'll notice I've got my machine set up, and I highly recommend watching the machine configuration guide on how to set up your machine. But in this case, I've set mine up as a rotary machine, which means I've populated the correct post processor for my machine, which is the G-code wrap Y2A post, which is going to take the Y moves and wrap them and turn them into A moves. So the Y axis has been wrapped around because we're cutting along the X axis, so we can achieve that rounded toolpath. So let's go ahead and save our toolpath, and I'm going to call this one rounding toolpath. Click save. That is now ready for me to machine, and that is how you create a rounded toolpath. And if you want to learn more about rotary machining, we have several videos on our website and our YouTube page, and I highly recommend that you check them out and learn more about rotary machining. But with that said, we look forward to seeing you in the next video, and that concludes our tutorial.